Good afternoon and most welcome to 996. We are now situated almost in the safe room of Central Library of University of Gothenburg. This is actually 7 floors down. I have ventured into 5 floors down, and it's built from the beginning to be nuclear bomb safe, so that the books here would withstand an attack from a foreign nation. I don't know if that's still the case. I wonder with the modern bombs, but we feel pretty safe here from other things, interference from other humans. And today I will talk about interference, disturbances, but I will talk about it on an internal stage, so to speak. And this is how can I explain this, how we feel disturbed ourselves. One thing that's very common today that Dan Ariely, the author of Irrationality, pointed out is that many people have problems today with multi-leveler thinking. And when I was pondering about that, I thought, from a certain perspective, from a certain level, especially from my morning level, which is, I'm not a morning person, I could actually potentially feel the different levels to be disturbances, something that take away my focus. And that actually struck a point in me. Could it be that we are so unstable, so the different levels are actually possible and could already be present, but because we can't sustain disturbances and adversities, we feel that even our own different levels are disturbing us to some extent and actually taking one out of awareness. And this did actually happen to me on the train here. I don't usually go by train, but a lady came around asking for the tickets. And that was enough for me, because that's also another level. And it's also important for me to show the ticket, but I lost the first level. And this is what Dan Ariely is pointing out. That didn't used to be the case. People were very good at keeping different things going at the same time. And I feel that to be directionality, that there is a direction to what you're doing. I had the goal to get here, but I could have, or hopefully I have, bigger goals also. So the different goals don't have to be excluding each other. But sometimes for me they are. Being too focused on something will keep me from eating lunch, for instance. It seemed to be hard to keep different levels going at the same time. And I think that is related to we can't handle disturbances. Maybe from the outer world, that problem is not a fact here, but should we stand outside in a nearby street, people will be passing and there could be a possible disturbance. And how do we tell disturbances from good things? It's very hard as well. But I think it's sort of an immune reaction to take away one's own thinking in the end, because we are preserving organism. We want to keep ourselves intact, integrated, and might be an act of self-preservation that takes away the other levels, even the levels I choose, so that I can continue on one level, I think. And that is something we learn from chaos theory as well. And how do we integrate more and more? And I think the senses here do play a role, because in the standard view we all differentiate between the different senses, and we do it after the fact. We never do it when it happens. That is neurological impossible. We just have one experience, and then we sort of divide that experience subjectively, and I would say randomly, because we do it before the case, do it before even it had the possibility to reach our consciousness or whatever that is. So that is in itself very problematic. And I was thinking about the Necker cube here. Necker cube was found somewhere in the 19th century, I think 1870, 1860. And it was a man looking into a microscope, and he took one gander at a constructed crystal, and then possibly he took a sip of coffee or something, and then he had to continue to look back, and all of a sudden the crystal was gone and it was replaced by another crystal. He was of course very shocked by this, so possibly he took another sip of his coffee, went back to the microscope, once more it was a different crystal. This was a huge sensation. In one way of seeing it, it was the same crystal, but chemically, structurally, molecularly, they were completely different. So there is actually two different existences from every point of view, but in an ordinary sense, common language sense, is the same thing. How odd. The Necker cube is fantastic. It is one of the most marvelous things there ever is. But it's not only fantastic, it's a fantastic metaphor how everything works. And the Necker cube you can actually look at, and you can see it change from being one molecule to another, or being one organizational system to another. And it's actually the same thing as, for instance, a zebra all of a sudden turning into a rabbit, or a napkin, whatever. It is that strange, actually. This is the first time in world history we discovered anything similar to that, as we know of. And this is also a very interesting take on the senses. By sticking to only one picture of the Necker cube, one reality of the Necker cube, it could be that we are sort of blocking out the others, and then we are making the information, the knowledge, the understanding that comes to us much lesser. And that could actually wean us. I think it's with a simple V. Vänja oss. Tillvänja oss. Wean us.
Accustom.
No. It's more like
Get used.
No, it's wean is when you take mother's milk.
Okay. I
be
get
weaned
it.
off.
Yes. Of course.
Condition possibly, but weaned, I think this suits. We get weaned to the idea of not having too much knowledge around us, and therefore become more simplified. As I mentioned before, the chaotic system takes its feed from what could be seen as disturbances on some level, but they are all beneficial. Like the different levels, it's my thinking, I need that thinking. This is for my survival, but still we know, because of Dan Ariely, that somewhere 72% of the population cannot hold parallel thinking. And that is rather severe, because many actions that we take during the days take parallel thinking. We need to keep our eye on different juggling balls. And I would say that at least 5 of them, could be 20, could be more. So this is an important survival thing. And of course, since Dan Ariely is talking about survival, how to plan, how to get better, that's an important thing. But it also bears to mind when it comes to our system as integrated and integral beings. And this real division between senses could actually do us harm in the end. We don't get necessary complexity, call it information, but if I block out hearing, which I do now, block out hearing, I want to hear my own voice, I want to hear how it sounds, I cannot longer locate myself in the space I'm in. The only thing I can hear is the ventilator. And I checked the ventilator out before. You can take the picture from this way, if you come here. This is a ventilator. I learned from experience always to check the ventilators, whether they suck the air or push the air out. I had a terrible experience a couple of years ago, so I learned from that. But that made me aware of the sound of the ventilator. But optimally, it should be like I just go into the room and I'm directly aware of such a thing, because it's not soft. I think it will even be recorded on the mobile. So, and this is important. This is how our system locates itself. If I don't have the sound coming up to my consciousness, I won't be located. I need to listen to the echo of my voice, and it could be even my heartbeat will respond in a certain way to the environment. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because human beings have and always will be already in the world. Those factors are of physics, and it would be no chance on Earth that we haven't adapted to that. And now there was another sound here. Okay, we get back to this place. Yes, I know what that sound was. Yeah, sure.
On which book did you select today as the basis of your lecture?
There is two books actually. The book of Dana Ariely, Irrationality, from 2011, I think. But there is also the book of Julian Jaynes coming up later here. It's yes, an odd lecture, but it has its purpose.
Okay.
Why it's odd. I'll come to that. It's there was another sound going on now, and I couldn't decipher it. It was a humming sound, and because I was previously aware using, and this is sort of a secret between us listening to the video, we have access to water here. And I thought somebody reached to the water and opened the faucet. But it wasn't that. What it was is this old system of communication they still have at the university library, which is in itself very interesting. They look like this, small missiles, and you open them up and you put a piece of paper in, and pneumatically these things will be sent to different areas of the library, and they are pushed by very, very heavy air, like a big pressure coming out, and you have to be careful if you're going by one when the hatch is open. You can get struck in your head. So that was the sound I hear. To be honest, I didn't think it was still in working, or maybe it could also be that they haven't had the time to get rid of the system, but it's still working. I can still hear the air pressure. So you see here, now I deviated, I digressed, but I'm still keeping my eye on the purpose of the lecture. And the point I want to make here is that there is always a neck-cube relationship going on. It doesn't matter what it is. It is not a unique feature of the universe. And I think, and this is really interesting, when they discovered the neck-cube, they thought, this is unique. This is not how the world is. It took like 40-50 years until we reached quantum mechanics, when we discovered that is exactly how the world is. And that goes for everyday life as well. It's not exclusive to the neck-cube. My example comes from two books. One big book by Julian Jaynes, and the other one by Ian McGilchrist. And I read the book by Ian McGilchrist, let's see here.
Last year.
Last year when I was...
Increase.
Yes, that's true. And I noticed that Julian Jaynes is very, very often mentioned in the book. And then I came to a certain passage in the book, and It was also a YouTube clip where Ian McGilchrist was interviewed, and they were talking about a certain subject. I think it was schizophrenia, and he underlined, he emphasized that I'm completely contrary to Julian Jaynes, and the matter was about schizophrenia. Julian Jaynes wrote a book about the bicameral mind, and
76.
And his conclusion in that book, to cut it short here, is going to be too brief to understand, but it is that schizophrenia, nowadays schizophrenia as it was perceived in 1976, could be a remnant of the bicameral mind. The bicameral mind, according to Julian Jaynes, was that on a previous level, before the pre-Socratic, maybe even before the Iliad, or somewhere in that time, people perceive their inner thinking, the endogenous thinking, as not really situated in the head or within themselves. They thought it was the voice of spirit, could be the gods or a god, could be different things. And that is continuing for quite some while. He has some proof of this, and then slowly disappear. People are to a lower frequency referring to the gods speaking directly to them in a perceptual voice, and so that they can write it down, and that diminish, and in the end the speak from the gods is more like indications or associations or dreams, could be daydreams, and that took place during the later Iliad. You can notice that all of a sudden it's more seldom that they actually speak to people. It's more that they perceive the gods to think that, or they dream about them, and sometimes they do see them as well. And you can, I think you understand where my conclusion is going to go, or the conclusion of Julian Jaynes's. His conclusion is that schizophrenia, which is the fact that you hear voices which are not part of your people around you, they're coming from somewhere or anywhere, and these voices are heard by the schizophrenic. This is true actually. They do actually hear these voices. So he assumed, and I think this conclusion is quite interesting, he assumed that schizophrenia could be a remnant of this bicameral mind, and that in certain characters, certain people, maybe the inherited trait of being more bicameral and having not evolved sufficiently, or maybe a potentiality within the body that gets this form of development. That's the conclusion of Julian Jaynes. And in this discussion, we need to focus on this discussion on YouTube, where Ian McGilchrist was interviewed. Julian Jaynes wasn't present. And he said, I don't agree with Julian Jaynes here. I actually am completely the contrary thought in his impossible voice to imitate. It's like a little bit Scottish, mostly British. And then at that instance, in this YouTube clip, I felt that being very opposed, because what Ian McGilchrist is saying is schizophrenia is a modern thing, that it wasn't present before the 18th century. So it's complete opposite, and his explanation for the whole thing was also opposite. And also general train of development, where Julian Jaynes saw the dissolvement of the bicameral mind as mostly positive. Ian McGilchrist saw the same thing, he names it differently, as something partly negative. And at the very end, especially in modern day, something incredibly negative. Thereof the name of his book, The Master and His Emissary, where this other part, the part that Julian Jaynes thought was good, actually takes over. So that was the take I got it. So what is my view of the whole thing? Well, it's a rather sharp polarity between Julian Jaynes and Ian McGilchrist. So they are on opposing sides. And I continue to read the book, and I continue to have that view as well. And that continued despite the fact I read in the book certain pointers to Julian Jaynes in a positive manner from Ian McGilchrist himself. That was ignored by me. This is the polarity reading. This is something that, for instance, Derrida could deconstruct for me. He can show, look at these passages. Ian McGilchrist is not negative to Julian Jaynes in a strong way anyway. Now, with the Necky Cube and how Julian Jaynes and Ian McGilchrist came back yesterday, Calibor's book by Julian Jaynes or something similar, I've been thinking about that again, and I realized in the end, when I read the book, that for some mad reason Ian McGilchrist likes Julian Jaynes a lot, very much, very appreciative of his work. But now I understood, it's the Necky Cube thing. Even though they are at a certain level completely opposed, in the structure there is something that is very similar between Ian McGilchrist and Julian Jaynes. So a certain level or a level down, there's a polarity. They should probably disagree if they met. But the absolute majority, when you come to the structure, if you really go into how the two authors have produced, it's obvious that Ian McGilchrist has gotten a lot of his knowledge from Julian Jaynes. And although at a certain level there is an opposition, there is also a structural similarity. And when I say structure, it sounds like this is something you can easily find out. Here's the book, The Master and His Emissary. Grand book. If you haven't read it, do it. Could be the best part of literature that could come out to humanity since the Bible and Shakespeare. Yes.
So if I understood correctly, Julian Jaynes says that the Homeric man had some traits of the schizophrenic, while McGilchrist thinks that the Homeric man was healthy.
Something in that business. Yes, something in that vicinity. But we have to remember that the schizophrenia that Julian Jaynes is talking about, the pre-Socratic man, it's not an unhealthy schizophrenia, although in the modern society it will be an unhealthy schizophrenia, of course, for obvious reasons. Sorry.
Yes.
I digress there, sorry. Of course, it would be very problematic. And this is, of course, his reasoning from Julian Jaynes. Excellent, Kalle. This is how Julian Jaynes reasoned. So you pointed out very sharply there. But it could have deeper levels. And those deeper levels is something that Ian McGilchrist enters into. And this is even more interesting, I did not enter into those details. I couldn't. I couldn't go that down into the book. That took 1 year. And now I realize there is an interesting nesting, and when I mention the word structure, it's not something simple. This is structures that maybe you can't even point out. They're still structures, but it's not certain you can verbalize them. Some of them, yes, but not all of them probably. And this is, what I mean here is the bicameral mind and Ian McGilchrist's book are similar to a certain extent, to a large extent, although they are opposing. And from my perspective, how I read the book, you need to remember this was a primer for me. You could say that I read it from the perspective of Professor Antwood. And therefore I could not go into the depth of the book. I wasn't allowed by my own starting point to understand the deeper structures. This is why I learned the book, learned a lot from the book. I could not have been without it. It was incredibly important. And what does it mean that the book is incredibly important? It means that you changes. You're not the same person after you read it. And all other books I will read henceforth will be read differently. And they will also be dealt with in a way that is more encompassing, less of that polarity way I had when I read this book. I won't blame myself and call myself dumb or anything like that, but because I think most of the people who saw this YouTube clip where he discussed Julian Jaynes would have come to the same conclusion. But there still would have been a percentage, either because they know both Julian Jaynes and Ian McGilchrist, which is not rare because there's so many reference to Julian Jaynes in the book, so you will become interested. I was on the verge of borrowing the book myself, but because I had still at that point some fear about losing Ian McGilchrist, I was a weak, chaotic system, I didn't read it. But that also proves my point. I felt my chaotic system to be too weak, so I can't read his opposer, even though Ian McGilchrist himself praised him. So this shows that there are underlying tendencies, and for instance, this is of course these tendencies, structures, striata, directions that Derrida uncovers. And I have no idea how this made-up character, Professor Antwood, would have read a book. But I have to take myself as an example. The first time I heard careful reading coming from Derrida, I thought careful reading actually meant, I'm being honest now, really selling out myself. Careful reading would be that you don't miss out on a single letter, that you read every word. And somewhere in my head I was thinking to myself, how could anyone miss a word? Because if you make like a big book, it's bound to be read by at least 20 people before it's even published. So you don't miss out on words. And that is, of course, the Professor Antwood take. Being in a singular point, not having a projection, not having a retention, not being able, not being broad enough to take in what is said. And obviously what Derrida was talking about is structures that takes use. You have to be complex yourself. You have to be sharp like Derrida to find these structures. Once they're pointed out, you can acknowledge them and you're no longer a victim for them. Or I have to add, you can also be like having a lot of gain from them. Could be either or, could be both. So let me make a couple of conclusions here. Just a pointer here. This has already happened once. And I think I mentioned that, but the take Julian Barber has toward Newton is the same thing. Julian Barber is such a polite man, so he doesn't utter almost one critical word about Newton. But he is inside Newton. What Julian Barber did to Newton was to deconstruct him. And he got rid of those polarities, the things I felt to be important, and show them to not take any part, not in the Newtonian theory, neither in the new theory of quantum mechanics. And that's very elegant. That's incredibly smart of Julian Barber. And I think it's so smart, it's my guess. I cannot say that. I'm not a physicist, I think that there is a lot of physicists out there who don't understand what Julian Barber has made, what he has accomplished, because he's inside Newton. That is just fantastic. How can you be inside a system already arranged and still finding clues that Newton himself would have accepted without a doubt? And that once more shows the Necker cube. So I want to make four claims on the Necker cube. The first one being, there is always in any text, bar no one, a Necker cube feature going on. And in a way, we don't have to infer the subject as such in any text. And this is an odd claim on me. This is not what I claimed before. But I would say you can find the subject in its totality in the text. And that would mean that we do not, like David Chalmers, as I mentioned yesterday, the constructor, the Australian professor who constructed the hard problem, which is much discussed even today, 25 years later. We don't have to infer consciousness. It is somehow already always in the text. It could actually be, and this is more of a guess, it could be senseless to add consciousness to this, because you add something that is already in place and already working. And that would make this extra subject or consciousness redundant and even problematic. It would be a supplement, if you use a Derridian word. I would say all the qualities of the subjects are already in the object. And what David Chalmers did was making the whole thing mysterious, because he doesn't offer any explanations, and the hard problem sounds much harder than it is. I will not go to that extent as the other Hawkins did, actually, the physicist. What's his first name? Hawking. The physicist who died 2 years ago. It's not Ian Hawking, is it? No.
No.
The physicist Hawking, he said, when I hear the word consciousness, I uncock my gun. That's a bit tough. I won't go to that extent. And I think actually in this case, even though it sounds similar to what I'm saying, I think Hawking means something different, that there is no mathematical explanation for consciousness. This is not exactly what I mean here. The second is, it is actually the Necker cube and the Necker cube-like features that give strength to the text, gives it its force, gives it possibility to actually deepen your understanding. But from a lower perspective, if you're down here, it would seem that the Necker cube-like features makes the text fluctuate between different meanings. And since you want to keep down here one single take on the text, otherwise you will fall apart, because your chaotic system can't sustain this fluctuating thing, the movement. You will need to get away with that, and therefore you get into the region of monosemic thinking. It could only be one meaning. Something I encountered not so much in literary criticism as in linguistics and in philosophy, the urge to have only one meaning, and the undermining of that, which is terrible for some people, like the 3 deans of Cambridge, 1985, when Derrida was to be made honorary professor of Cambridge. But here comes my point. On a higher level, taking away the polysemic or the fluctuating would actually lead to fluctuations. Here, what is seen as fluctuations up here is stability of meaning. It is the force of meaning. It's the directionality of meaning. So on a certain level, it seems that the words are fluctuating between different meanings, but on a higher level, this is what makes something really mean something. And what could happen, possibly, I don't know if it's possible, but if the monosemic Professor Ant would take on the text wins somehow, if that's possible, it would mean that the meanings on a higher level are lost, and the text will still fluctuate down here, but because the very action of trying to fix the meaning is bound, as I showed, to lead to more difference, to even more fluctuations. That will show that the text is constantly in movement down here, and that energy is what is perceived as being direction on a higher level. One grand author of that is, of course, William Shakespeare. He is so obvious that he uses several meanings all the time from the low level, and he actually adds meanings. He invented at least 300 words, and those words were not even of the English language when he invented them. And there is actually a Shakespearean word here. I don't know if you noticed it. And now it's gone. There is the divided brain and the making of the Western world. That is a Shakespearean. Because Shakespeare is constantly using this making, and he compares this to the unmaking. And what he indirectly is referring to is the unmaking of the Western world. Unmaking is a neologism of Shakespeare. He loved those words when he put on, like in Swedish, omöjlig, ogjord. This makes everything much stronger, more decisive, more telling, more encompassing. And it also adds to the very sharpness of language. And this disappears on the lower level. And I think that to be more and more obvious, how we actually rid the text of the meaning. And it becomes subjective as well, because everyone does this in like a subjective, emotional way, because they need to protect themselves for what they perceive to be fluctuations. The third one, now we jump into physics. This also shows what happens in physics. To have something precious, or what we need things to be able to do what they do. They need to be able to fluctuate. This is the reasons in the lectures of Auge Bohr he constantly repeated, don't come with existence here. And that doesn't mean that he didn't like existence. It means that existence comes later, once you ask the why question. And all of a sudden, I don't have to be philosophical with the why question, because in quantum mechanics, it's very clear what we mean with a why question. What will we have in the end? Will we have a Higgs boson? Will we have a meson? Will we have a quark? All those things is what we find out when we do the calculations. That are the constructs, so to speak. If we start with an existent, we'll be completely screwed off. That could never happen when we start with an existence. What we create is an existence. Or we don't create an existence. We still have that choice. All the calculations that was made with quantum mechanics were responsible for the creation of the Higgs boson. It wouldn't be there otherwise. And to say that it is an existence, it's in some ways a bit of an exaggeration. It only lasts like millionths of a second. Not usually what we call existences. What Augebor said to the people working, we need to ask the direction. What do we want to construct? Where are we going with this? And this is a more sensible question in physics. It's a sensible question, whatever we do. Why are we doing it? Otherwise, we will be animals of habit or unconscious. You see here what consciousness is, why it is unnecessary to add consciousness. Consciousness is the very direction everything is taking. And what Augebor says in one meaning, I want you to do work here. If you go with existence, the work is finished. We want you to do calculations for a purpose. We don't know the purpose in every instance, but we know there is a purpose. But with existence, there is no longer a purpose. So what should they do there? Just claim existence? That's a stopping point. You might as well go out of the room. It's a little bit like saying beforehand, even long before you made the calculations, I know the calculations to turn out somehow. This is actually what he was reacting to. He wanted the people to do the calculations, not to undo them, to use a Shakespearean term. I think it was Prince de Broglie, he would have shouted to them, you want to go drink coffee or something? Go away, don't bother me anymore. I don't think there is an exaggeration to say that the Necker cube is present in physics and is often used in explanations of quantum mechanics or similar devices. But the more important point is that it actually exists everywhere, in whatever thing we are so to speak, entering into. It is always present in the text, it is present in what I'm saying now, but it's also present in space itself. And that is maybe even more interesting, because by deeming space to subsist of existence and non-existence, that is in itself a limitation of the possibility. And as I mentioned before, this British physicist, who is very, very traditional, Stephen Wolfram, has actually proved we only need space to make calculations, no matter if it's classical physics, if it's topology, or if it's quantum mechanics. We have no use for existence at that level. Existence is something that springs out of space. And meaning is also something that springs out of the text, if we let it to. We can enter more and more into the text. It doesn't really have a limit to it. We can see the beauty of the text in the same way as we of course can see the beauty of a picture more and more. The better we are sort of differentiated, the better we are complex. To a higher level we will receive more. That doesn't mean that any picture, that the picture, one of the lower kinds of picture, would tell you a lot. No, what you will enter is true beauty. That beauty is shared by others. Not because there is a rule that says there, not because there is a physical law that says that everyone has to experience Mona Lisa to be beauty. No, because it's actually in the painting. It's not law-driven, it's in the painting. And this is what I mean when I say it's in the text. The object and the subject are both in the text to some extent. So when we lose that high level of understanding, this is when we start looking for the subject everywhere. And then in this hysterical search for the subject, we invent consciousness or intention. But all of a sudden, understanding what is the world will actually reveal intention in the world. And we don't have to look for it, because hypostasing consciousness could actually be a straw man. Something that is really easy to attack from the other people, like Daniel Dennett. And I realize more and more what Daniel Dennett is attacking is this straw man, this extra consciousness of David Chalmers. And I don't agree with Daniel Dennett, but I see what he means, yes, to a certain extent. Why have a consciousness that doesn't have an effect in the world? That is problematic in itself. But that doesn't mean I agree with Daniel Dennett, not at all. My take on Daniel Dennett is similar to the one. I have nothing to gain from Daniel Dennett. Maybe to some little extent, but it's not the same relationship between me and Daniel Dennett as Julian Jaynes and Ian McGilchrist have to each other. But still, I can see his point to some degree. Yeah, well, we better round off here. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye-bye for now.